It's so wonderful to see everybody here, and it's really nice to connect into ocean sound, connect with people who find this topic interesting. It's always great. The talk that I'm giving is a little experimental, a small, you know, I like to take little kind of stretches in my presentations and my talks to try and work with what I'm interested in. So to bring in some of the kind of creative composing into the talk itself. So bear with me, and I hope that you enjoy the sort of interludes that happen in between. And so, yes, as mentioned, I work a lot with ocean-human relations, and my work really is about inquiring into this. So not really from the point of having too much methodology first, but letting the inquiry unfold and following these trails. And this started, I do this in my artwork and my writings, and this really started during my PhD, which I've completed now, but it leaks back to many years ago to a voyage that I did across the Indian Ocean some years back. Because there's an ongoingness in the encounters that I experienced over there, the encounters with the ocean that have, you know, I'm continuously changing in relation with what happened over there. So I keep returning to this and trying to make sense of what happened. And so much of it is actually unwordable. It's kind of in this weathering, unwordable space inside of me. So I'm trying to find utterances. So I can never really fully describe, but these utterances are, I think, you know, I'll speak to that, and that's where I come to kind of the notion of composing from the space and finding these utterances. And they really scale the ways that my relations with the ocean have changed. And so the returning, I return through listening and thinking about static, as it rises through the loss of radio signal and searching for the weather broadcast station out in the ocean. And that moment of losing the radio signal and coming into static on the radio marks a loss of terra firma, land-based comforts that I was very much holding on to. And it marked a necessary turn to the ocean. And it's that turn that has become my return again and again, because so much changed in the turning from what I knew to what I didn't know. And so that's where a lot of my artwork and thinking returns, and my inquiry just sits in vortexes in that kind of turn there. Static, for me, has come to represent something that's beyond loss. It's beyond the net of the broadcast signal. It allows us to go, static allows us to go into the net and through the net and past the net. And it's a site or a zone where meaning can be made from and meaning can be made through, where becoming undone means becoming recomposed at the edges of what is known and unknown. And so listening into this is building relationships and changing the ways that I relate to the ocean. So I find listening to static a very relational exercise and experience, and it reconfigures how I relate to the ocean itself. This kind of relationing really challenges terra firma and human exceptionalist ways of relating. And there's a turn towards the potentials of relating more oceanically here. So the ocean represents multiplicious activities that sound through this uninterrupted vastness. Some of them are heard, some of them are felt. Mostly these sounds are unknown because the human hearing range is really thin in comparison to what sounds through the various vibrations and frequencies, especially in the ocean. And my body has a reliance on hearing through my ear and air, which is very different to perceiving sounds under the ocean. So there's a lot of unknowing when you consider listening in the ocean. As perceptions of this unknowability scale, there's this incredible isolation and incredible connectedness that becomes possible to reach and unreach at the same time. So I want to explore perception as a surface line between the potentials held in becoming and unbecoming with the unknown. So perception becomes a surface. And the noise that is this changing perception line. I'm interested in the noise that it makes, the discomfort and the transcendence of change. Not only as the line sheds itself, but also through the continuous generation of the new skin that the line becomes, as it necessarily holds this reconfiguring shape and presence with what is present. So I think of this line as the edge of broadcast signal as it touches static. There's a band, and on the edge of that band, slowly it crackles into static. And so that line is not necessarily something solid, it's this kind of movement from what is known into what is, what else is. Static, in this sense, can be thought of as an interrupting signal that is an opening, spotting, a spot, a hole, a gap junction, a tiny pore. It's the intrusion of Gaia, the interference pattern and the diffraction pattern of two parts interacting together. But I really like the notion of the tiny pore, of the hole in the tiny pore, because it helps me to think of breathing and breathing with more and breathability with that which is patterning in that space of change. And in this, I like to think about signal as waves. So signal comes in sine waves, which are then fractalized with information and fractalized more and more and more, in much the same way that the ocean's waves are also fractalized with information more and more and more. The ocean is a really rich place to think about sound for me when I think about waves in action. And it's also interesting to think about the frequency of vibrational waves that occur through living organisms, wherein bodies are both transmitters and receivers. And there's a duality, a two-wayness of this kind of frequency that happens between points of tension. So my body is encoded, fractalized, and it's sounding, it's giving off vibrational waves that scale through this unknowing. As I don't know, I'm also sounding off this unknowing, whether it's through my own perceptions of self-noise that come up and my disturbances of not liking the sound of static or not feeling comfortable in this big, vast ocean space. These are all things that I'm transmitting. And all the way down to the frequencies, the very unique frequencies that my cells are making, that contain almost everything in the whole universe. So I'm really drawn into scale when I think about trying to listen and trying to sort of learn and listen in the ocean. In the ocean, the incredible lonesomeness that arises from the loss of broadcast signal and land-based ways of knowing scales through the sensing of these vibrational frequencies that both receive as well as transmit. Bodies in loss are bodies in contact. Lonesomeness is pitted into with presences. Lonesomeness is not aloneness. It is an awareness of the interruption, the pitting into signal of preference. It contains the potential for finding breath with the opening pause and the spit and crackle in changing fractals. Breathing through the tiny spotting pause in a space that is beyond what is known brings us into the plurality of frequency. Tuning into presences and signaling toward them become possible. This is an encounter at the edge, in and with the whole, which is also, I guess, the whole. What I've found useful in my inquiring with art over here is that it always brings me into a space of reorienting. I feel like there's reorienting potentials here that I keep wanting to try and understand. And in reorienting, there's this discomfort, this what was that is now mutating, a transmogrifying, like salt transmogrifies when it touches metal and creates rust. There's an interference and intrusion, and the diffraction happens here, and it's reorienting within all of that activity. And my work and my thinking tries to remain here and drift in this. So I try to create sort of durational work, stay as long as I need to for the inquiry to kind of unfold and find itself. And drift. Drift means to move, to be moved by what is moving. Drifting in a current, your feet are off the ground, and you're being moved by what is moving. And inside this drifting, it's possible to sense how to open into the holes and breathe into their potentials for being pores and for being porous. This reorienting occurs before method and before narrative construction and before meaning making occurs. Even though it can be taken up as meaning making, you're trying to get back into that space before you have secured a kind of a knowledge about something. Could you go to the video, please? This video that I'm going to show really demonstrates this kind of reorienting, attempted reorienting. And it's a return for me to the searching of the weather broadcast signal, but this time I was in Johannesburg, stuck on land during the pandemic, and I was meant to go to the ocean for my studies and I couldn't go. So I found myself searching through the radio broadcast signal because that was something that I had done out in the ocean, trying to find stations. And I realized that I was, from moving along trying to find signal, I started to move, because you'll see it's a spectrogram, so it shows the visuals of the sound. I found myself moving into the big, dark, empty spaces, which weren't empty of sound. They were the noisiest places. They were thick with sound. That was the thick static. And so this is just a demonstration of that being lost and drifting in the moments of trying to orient within all of this. And of course, later on, I've kind of made sense of it.
Seem to be working full screen.
That's fine.
Sorry.
I think I'm experiencing something similar, and I told my co-host to copy it.
This exercise of returning to exploring static returned me to movement within a particular location where we sailed across the Western Indian Ocean, and that's along the spine of the Agulhas Current, which is one of the strongest currents that flow down. And as it happened, we were trying to travel up this current. And the Indian Ocean is known to be the most sensitive ocean in the world because of the weathering activities that occur there. And I think that high weathering activity occurs because of this vast presence of the ocean that's largely uninterrupted in that part of the ocean. And the elemental activity that we were moving within is spheric. It's not horizontal, and it's not even vertical. It's both vertical, horizontal, and more. And our ship was sailing in this kind of horizontal cut across it on the surface of the water, which cut through the elements that acted all over. And this sounds in the static. Static picks up, static is the sound of spherics. So sensitizing to this means sensitizing to this location and everything that that it is activated through. There's a zone that's a little above the surface and below the surface that I find interesting to measure how this activity of the surface exists. And so I just want to focus a little bit on the notion of the surface and on the notion of below now. And in the Indian Ocean, the surface largely represents this flourishing of networks historically, a movement of bodies, trades, religion, economies, and labor, and all of which, when traveling through on top of the ocean, must have been encountering the sensitiveness of this ocean. And I think we can see that in the ways that the trade was built with the changing monsoon winds. The surface over here becomes a horizon line. It's an expansion of vision, growth and spread towards new frontiers. And that certainly attracted a lot of attention, and it attracted imperialism, capitalism. And this is when we see, during this time, we see the ocean starting to become a backdrop in the imaginaries and in literature for voyages and conquests. And the ocean starts to become this vast void, this emptiness, this nothingness in this imagination. The uneven power within this slowly begins to silence oceanic ways of knowing that grow through traditional practices, indigenous knowledges, and the trade routes. And this is where these over-determining narratives, as Sylvia Windsor might call them, start to thicken as they become constructed through those who benefit from land theft, slavery, and processes of global extractivism that focus on controlling what is seen through colonial terra firma visions for people who live far away. And so much of this is still patterned in the presence. It is the frequency of now in the ocean space and the lands around it. Elemental activity, however, draws the surface out of this imagining of the horizontal and into the vertical. And there's a shift of perception here as the elements act all around. So thinking elementally helps us to shift this perspective. The surface becomes a weathering zone for this perspective shift, constantly weathering in between this weathering line. The surface of the ocean is actually has been called the epipelagic zone, or the sunlit zone, that extends from the surface to about 200 feet below. And this sunlit zone is a patterning for the belows and the aboves, and emits a signal, I would like to think of this in-between space. So that's the potentials of thinking of the surface. And the below the surface is the space that's a little beyond capture, the space that exists past the net and in the dark, where activities like churn happen. And this can be seen manifesting in oceanic theorizing, such as Elizabeth Delochry's Heavy Waters, that are heavy with the waste of modernity. Also, Christina Sharp's bodies that exist, the bodies of slaves and the particles of slaves that still exist in and circulate in residency time. The movement that allows for Paul Gilroy's Black Atlantic, that understands Black culture through the movements of the ocean, and Camus Brathwaite's Tidalectics, that come into an intimacy of the ocean to build an oceanic worldview. And also the turn to working through elemental activity and post-colonial scholarship, such as Isabel Hoffmeyer's recent book, Hydrocolonialism. These congeal through various imaginings of connection and disembodiment in the elemental and oceanic activities. Churning in here is churning with discomfort, where comfort and discomfort mix, being stirred with presences. There's a destabilizing of the surface, so that is what inside can mix. A loss of grip, so that bonding becomes possible. Different bondings become possible. Spiritual and mythical figures residing under the ocean reveal bonding and connectedness of what this churning potential holds. They draw you into the multi-directional potential of becoming with the ocean. In encountering them, the surface and below open toward each other, where to sink becomes to rise. And I particularly like this Joseph Campbell description of these mythic imaginaries being sort of currents, where he says these figures are taken up to be human beings, odd and exceptional indeed, yet as self-oriented as you or I, or at least as we suppose ourselves to be. They are not actually so, but they open up behind, so to say, toward the universe. And I feel that there's this, through this opening, there's this current that opens, that funnels in wayward directions, and the holes that appear on the surfaces pull us into these funnels. In thinking on them, the experience of moving through the twirling bodies and cyclonic eddies appears for me. Cyclonic eddies are very active in the Western Indian Ocean world, and they are elemental weathering systems, and they suck up nutrients. They're an upwell of nutrients from the depth that rise to the surface and disseminate across the ocean and move through the currents until they move around the whole planet, and they proliferate phytoplankton growth and photosynthesis and generate our every second breath that we have here on land. I'm always still moving in them as they open toward the planetary and beyond. Being on the ocean's surface means cutting through the belly of their activity in patterns of chaos to calm to chaos to calm. When I flew back after my trip and I looked down on the clouds below, I saw the holes of this activity, the holes of the tops of the vortexes of the eddies, which are little cyclones, cyclonic activity. And I have since learned that below these holes, which are clear and calm on the surface, there's this activity of churning that funnels down, and they act as one, and they act in trains, they entrain each other, and there's an immense scale here, scaling on a planetary scale. But I found myself looking for the tiniest dot inside of them on the surface of the ocean that could be another boat sailing through them. And that represents this minute experience from within their immensity. I now know that this entire scale sounds in static, from the lightnings to the calm experience sailing through them, the lightning on the periphery and the storms on the periphery. The below and the above all pull open a tension of frequency that produces an oscillating body that is a multi-cyclic climate of unity. In such oceanic frequency, drawing up is drawing down, or as David White, the poet, says, the unutterable aloneness touches the unutterable togetherness at the coded and encoding surface. And this surface, this coding, this utterance, is poetic transmission, the act of sending signal from the surface, an action to take up. This transmission is being fully present with the above and the below. It's congealing and dissipating at the same time. and then spreading toward the light to photosynthesize climates of breathability. This is a complex poiesis, an energetic vision of the world in transformation, or what Edward Glissant might call poetics of relation. Attuning to the poetic transmission is attuning to reception itself. It is communicating or transmitting what is being received, bridging the perceived gap between and revealing the in-between. Composing as poetry is creating transmissions through the undulations of wave information that is moved by the activities of the aboves and the below along the spine of the current as it sounds through the vernix of perception. Can we go to the next? I can do that.
Sorry.
Yeah. Elemental activity is a great place to consider the activity of composing. Nicole Staroselsky says that elemental media is relational and that elements compose. They open new sites to track where difference materializes. Elements are neither essential nor foundational. Elements compose. The choice of what compositions to attend to and the language of distinction has geopolitical implications. Elements are not discrete, they are not relational. Elements never fully stand alone. They attach, bond, and transform. Infrastructure transitions, hardware falls apart, and molecules separate. The elemental is not epic, it is particulate. Encountering elemental activity is sensing what is in composition while also being composed within it. And it teaches me again about scale, scaling, and being scaled within presences. A working definition of static has to do with scale, specifically weight, a weighting that is a resting within presences. All that is present sounds in mass weight. Elemental media composes, like cell groups, forming larger electromagnetic beats of conjoined frequency. Presence is amplified. Hearts are wholes, are pores. Composing through elemental compositions is a sort of sense-making of being composed, a listening to the listening, a return to the encounter that rearranges. It is a surfacing act. Composing here finds an ongoing orientation with the immediate now, where the sound of presences scale in presence across spherics, and the noise of self is weighted too. And static is the sound of rest in this, where this is all resting. Sensing the weight of presences and the weight of self within them helps to perceive relational points to sink and rise within. And I'd like to end by playing an artist and fermenter's sound piece, Zayan Khan, called Ocean as Original Brine, that really brings you into a sense of scale. It scales in and within and finds a drifting in here as she transmits a blessing that ends with her swallowing the transmission. The intimacy of the scaling opens simultaneously to her thinking about ancestors as salt, or salt as ancestors, where salt is this ancestor of life as we know it. It seeded life in the original brine when the oceans were first oxygenated. In her composition, sounds are fermented and tasted, a pungent and nectarous invitation to consider inseparability, an opening to the universe below.
Oh, that's good.
So, unfortunately, that is best listened to. Fortunately or unfortunately, wonderfully, it's best listened to with speakers. I mean, with headphones, or with two speakers, because the sound oscillates and you become completely immersed in this world of bubbles all around you. So we can share that piece again, and if you'd like, then you can listen to it as well, maybe at home. But thank you so much.